Welcome anyone that's joined. We're just waiting a few minutes to get people in the room, and then we'll kick off the session. Okay, there's probably enough people. Hi everyone, my name's Russ Weakley from Intopia, and this is our first Intopia webinar of 2020. So thanks for coming along. Today's webinar is going to be about accessible names and descriptions. But before we get off, start this thing off, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. So I begin today by acknowledging the Camaragal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm hosting this event today. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, people who may be attending today's session. And the other thing is a couple of bits of housekeeping before we kick off. So this presentation and all resources are going to be available online, and I'll share the link with everyone at the end of the session. We've got time for a Q&A session. So if you've got any questions throughout the session, just add them into the Q&A. We'd like to thank AI Media for the live captioning, which is still spelled incorrectly on screen there. And a recording of today's webinar will be published on the Intopia YouTube channel sometime after the event. So stay tuned on our social media. So let's get into it. What are we going to cover today? Well, this session is going to cover 5 different things, and they are visible text labels. We're going to look at accessible names. And we're then going to look at the 2 of those concepts together. Do those concepts need to match? Then a brief discussion on accessible descriptions. And then we're going to dive into the real crux of this thing, which is what happens when there are more than one accessible name or description associated with a single element? Which one wins? And that's what we're going to find out today. So I can tell what you're already thinking. It's like, God, this sounds really dry and boring. And you may be right. And you're probably thinking, like, why do we care about accessible names and descriptions and these sort of things? They sound like very weird concepts to have to address. But the reality is that if you understand these concepts, they help in so many areas of accessibility. For example, if you're creating widgets, if you're troubleshooting, creating audits, etc. If I could go back to when I was beginning accessibility and give myself any knowledge, it would be a basic understanding of the accessibility tree, accessible names and descriptions. It would have saved so much pain that I had to learn gradually over the years. So let's dive into it. We'll talk about the tree, names and descriptions. Let's start with visible text labels. So this is going to sound very silly, but they are literally just labels that are presented on screen as text, not to be confused with accessible names or the label element. But let's take a look at some examples, and then it'll become a bit clearer. So a diagram on screen now, it's got a form label and a form control, and hopefully they're associated together with a for and ID. But inside the label is some text, saying label text. That is the visible text label for the form control. In the next diagram, we've got a button with some text inside. The text inside that button is the visible text label for that button. If we've got a link, the text inside the link is the visible text label for that link. But then we get to more complicated ones. If you've got a field set and there's a legend, which is the first child of that field set, that means it's the first element inside, and that has some text inside it, that legend text will be the visible text label for the field set. Similarly with the table, if there's a caption as the first child of the table, the text of that caption would be the visible text label for the table. And then the last example here is the section element. If you have a section element and there's a first child heading, and if they're explicitly associated, then the text of that heading would be the visible text label for that section. So then, if that's what a visible text label is, what is an accessible name? So accessible names are used by assistive technologies through the accessibility tree. And basically, these names help us identify and understand the purpose of elements in the accessibility tree. And they could be any sort of widget, like a button, a link, a form component, even things like date pickers. All these things should have some sort of accessible name. And you can see these very quickly using the accessibility tree. So let's go and do a quick example. We're going to take this button element. So we'll click on that link. We'll do an inspect element. And we'll go, I have to move something so I can see. And we'll go and look at the accessibility tree for that button. And you'll see here we have save. So this button has an accessible name of save. Quick example of an accessible name in action. So then we have this big question going on, which is, if we have an accessible object, do we need to have the same visible label as an accessible name? Do those two concepts need to match? Well, let's look at some examples. So in some cases, you might have something that matches perfectly. And we'll look at this example. So here we have a label and an input. The label says address. And if we do an inspect element on that input, and again, go to the accessibility tree, you'll see that the accessible name for that input is address. And if we look at the visible text label on screen, that's the same. So there's an example where the two match perfectly. But there are cases when they might partially or not match at all. And so let's have a look at an example where we've got some content that's hidden a bit off screen, but part of the label. So let's have a look here. Here we have a button on screen, and the button just says save. So that's its visible label. But if we do an inspect element, look at the accessibility tree, you'll see that the accessible name says please save. So that is slightly different to the visible text label of save. And if we open up, you'll see why. Inside, the actual text for the button says please save, but the word please has been wrapped in a span and hidden off screen. So these two are similar, but not exactly the same. And you could have an example the other way around. So let's have another look. This is again a button with save. If we hit inspect element, look at the accessibility tree. In this case, the accessible name says save and return, whereas the on-screen visible text label just says save. And again, if you look inside, you'll see the words save and return, but the words and return are being hidden off screen. But there's times when people might want to put, whether it's right or wrong, we'll talk about in a second, an entirely different content for one that's different to the other. So on screen, we have another button saying save, getting a bit repetitive, isn't it? And we go up here, look at the accessibility tree. In this case, you'll see we have totally different content from what's on screen. So we have, in our accessible name, we have return home, whereas the visible text label says save. So now we've got two entirely different pieces of information there. And that begs the question, is that a good idea? So while it can be done, it's not a good practice at all. We should always try and match at least some aspects of the visible text label to the accessible name. I think the question you probably ask is, does it matter? Why would it really matter? Well, the reason is that if there's a slight mismatch or a severe mismatch between those two concepts, that could be confusing to some users. Now, a quick example is myself. I have dyslexia, and so I will often use a screen reader to read out the contents on the page. And I'll use the highlighting visual highlighting to actually see what's on screen and read along with the screen reader. However, if what's on screen doesn't match the accessible name in the accessibility tree, you can get this weird thing where it looks different to what's being announced. So that could be very confusing for some users. And another example could be if you have an assistive technology user trying to describe some aspect of the UI, and if we went back to that button we just saw, and they said something like return home, and the sighted user is looking for a button saying return home, so there's nothing on screen like that at all. That is another example where you can get this confusing scenario, and vice versa. So it's not a good idea to be completely different in those two concepts. Let's have a look then about accessible descriptions. So there might be times when we're building sort of components, we want additional information on top of an accessible name. And that might be to provide some extra context for some sort of an element. So an example could be an input. And for that input, you want to put some help text to give more instructions, as well as the label. Or you want a label, but you also want an error message to tell the user that that input is in a state of error and how to fix the problem. So these pieces of content are referred to as accessible descriptions if they're applied correctly, and they're then exposed inside the accessibility tree. So let's go and have a look at an example again. So this is an input, and we'll try and find the accessible description. So in this example, we have a label called address. We have this floating piece of content which says include your full address, and then we have the input. If we inspect element and look at the accessibility tree again, the first thing to be aware of is we have a label with a 4 that matches the input. So these two are going to be explicitly associated, and that's meaning that we've got a great accessible name here. But that's not what we want to find out. What we want to find out is this additional text associated with that input. And if we go down a bit further in the accessibility tree, you can see a slot's just appeared called description. And that means that this piece of information is tied to the input and is giving us a description. And the question then is how? Well, in this case, it's done by the aria described by attribute. And its matching ID means that these two are explicitly associated, and now we have a description as well as an accessible name. Okay. But we can also do it in different ways, and I'll show you another way that you can put a description for an element. So in this case, we have an address as the label, and we have an input. We don't have a little bit of floating content though, but if we do an inspect element on it, and look at the accessibility tree, in this case, you'll still see we have a description. So we've got address and a description which says include your full address. But where's it coming from this time? Well, this time it's coming from the title attribute, and that's giving this input a description. Now, we can talk soon about how the title attribute is pure evil and shouldn't be used at all, but it does give us a description. So then that brings up this big question. What happens when you've got 3 or 4 or 1 or 2, whatever it is, different accessible names applied to an element? The same for descriptions. So we're going to look at an example. And in this example, as bizarre as it sounds, we've got 3 possible sources for an accessible name for that element. So here we have a simple form control with a label saying address. And we've got the input, and you can see there's a placeholder already in there. And it says, add your full address. And if we inspect element on that and have a look, you'll see that the first way, because this input is associated via the foreign ID, the first way we could give this element, the input element, a name is via the label. But you can also see there's another method in here that's being applied, which is the aria label. And as bizarre as it sounds, whoever built this is strange. And they've actually put a placeholder as well. So we've got 3 different methods that are vying for an accessible name. And the question then is, which one wins? So which one will be used to define that accessible name? Well, luckily, this has all been defined by the W3C. And they've got these documents that actually determine exactly how accessible names and descriptions are calculated and then defined in the accessibility tree. And the two documents riveting titles of, are you ready for it? Accessible Name and Description Computation 1.1 and HTML Accessibility API Mapping 1.0. And I've heard on Google Goodreads, they both have 5-star reviews, so well worth a read. But they're very dry documents that explain exactly how this occurs. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go and have a look at some elements and how these calculations work. So we're going to start with two elements, and we can put them together because they pretty well operate the same way in terms of accessible names. And we're talking about the A element and the button element. So in the case of these two elements, the accessible names are defined in the following order. Now we're going to see this in a similar form throughout a lot of these examples. But basically, first and foremost, if it's present, it will use the ARIA label by, or the value from the ARIA label by, if that's attached to an A element or a button element. If that's not present, it will look for an ARIA label. And if that's not present, it will actually use the element's content. Now, that's the one we should always be using. It's the most accessible, etc. But it's actually third in ranking. And if there's no content inside the button or the link, it will then look for a title. And if there's none of those above, that link or the button will have no accessible name. Now, in reality, with all these options available to you, you'd have to wonder how it's possible to create an A element or a button with no accessible name. But you'd be surprised at the wonders that people can achieve. So what we're going to do now is look at a button, and we'll see all of these different ways of applying accessible names in one. So what I'm going to do is, there's 5 different examples here. The first example has all of them, and then 3 of them, and then 2 of them, and then 1 of them, and then none of them. But what I've done is I've put a value to make it a bit easy for us. So what we should have is either 1, 2, 3, 4, or no value at all. And that will allow us to tell us which one wins. And what we'll do is we'll gradually remove these accessible name options one at a time and see how this operates. So let's look at example 09 to start with. So it's a button saying 3, and you see this tiny little word sitting below it called 1. We're going to inspect element, look at the accessibility tree, and look at the name, and it says 1. That's showing us that the ARIA label by is beating the others. And if we look here, there's something great going on that really shows us what's happening. The ARIA label by is there. It's beating the ARIA label, it's beating the content, and it's beating the title. And that's why the accessible name comes from the ARIA label by and is 1. Let's look at example 10. This time we've got a button, again saying 3. Oh, I actually clicked on the button by accident. Luckily didn't do anything. Go off to the accessibility tree. This time, because there's no ARIA label by, however, there is a label, it has a name of 2. And that's beating the content and the title. Let's look at example 11. Again, we have a button saying 3. If we inspect element on that one, look at the accessibility tree. In this case, the accessible name is 3. There's no ARIA label by, there's no ARIA label, there is contents, and that's beating the title. And number 12, have a look at this one. Inspect element. Now that button had no content at all, which is kind of horrifying to see. But in this case, there's no text inside, there's just a title. So there's no ARIA label by, no ARIA label, there's no content, but there is a title. And so that's used and it becomes an accessible name of 4. And then our last example is, truly terrible scenario. But obviously this is just a demo. But in this case, there's no ARIA label by, there's no ARIA label, there's no contents, and there's no title. So this literally has no accessible name, which is literally the worst case scenario for anything in the accessibility tree. Because in this case, it would just say button, no context of what that button would do. The key point here is that while there's all these amazing methods we can use to create an accessible name, in the case of links and buttons, we should try and use the element's content. That's obviously the most accessible and the best way to achieve the result. But what about the description? Is there some sort of cascade for that as well? And the answer is yes. Now, this is almost the same for all elements, so you'll see this repeated. But basically, if there's an area described by, that will be the accessible description. Otherwise, use the title. Otherwise, there's no accessible description. Now, keep in mind that we don't need to have an accessible description. Unlike an accessible name, which is super important, descriptions are just extra stuff to add value. So it doesn't matter if we actually get to the third scenario. But again, we're going to do the same thing. What we're going to do is to build an example which has 1 and then 2, and we'll see them. And what we should see is, in this case, instead of an accessible name, we're looking for an accessible description. So again, we'll remove these things as we go. Starting with 14, we have a button saying more, and below that's a little text saying 1. Inspect element, look at the accessibility tree, and let's go down and look at the description, and it says 1. That means the area described by is beating the title. So we have the value coming from the area described by. We don't need to worry about the name here. We're just focusing on the description. Let's look at the next one. Again, we've got a button saying more, inspect element. Look at the accessibility tree. We don't care about its accessible name. What we care about is the description. In this case, because there's no area described by, there is a title. And so that is giving the description of 2. And our third one should have no area described by or description at all. So it means that no title either. So it won't have any description. So there's a button. It's got an accessible name, but there's literally nothing there for the description. And that's because there's no area described by and there's no title. Now, theoretically, there's not very many times when you want to attach a description to a link or a button. Now, there may be times when you want to associate it with other content on the page for an action. It's very rare, but you could do it. But in those cases, it's much better to use the area described by than the title. And we'll talk about it soon, but the title is pure evil. So it shouldn't be used ever. But in this case, it's not good because the area described by has the added advantage that we can see it on screen. So let's talk a bit about this evil title. As we move through these various examples, you're going to see this strange thing occur. The title can be used for both the accessible name and the description, and it actually slides around depending on what's going on. So fundamentally, it's used as the last resort for the accessible name. So we've got aria label by, aria label, the contents of the button, and then title. So it's the last in that list. But it's also the last resort for the description. So we've got aria described by and title. But here's the thing that's even weirder. It'll actually change places. But it'll only change place down to the description if 2 conditions are met. The first one is that there's already some other accessible name and the title hasn't been used for the accessible name. And the other one is that there's no area described by being used for the description. In those cases, it will change from being a possible accessible name to a description. And we can see that in action. I'm going to go back to example 09. We've got a button with the words 3 in it. But if we look down here and look at the accessibility tree, you'll see something interesting. We have a title which could have been used for the accessible name, but it's being beaten by all these other options. In this case, being beaten by the aria label by, so that's become the accessible name. But because there's no other description, the title slides down and becomes the description for that element. So that just shows how strange and wonderful and terrifying the title attribute is. Generally speaking, though, it should only ever be used for things like iframes. Does anyone use iframes anymore? And it should never be used for an accessible description as it's highly inaccessible. It's not shown on screen. We could do a whole talk on how evil the title is. Okay, let's look at 2 different elements, and they're the input and text area elements. And we're going to look at some specific examples. So we're actually talking about input type equals text, input type equals password, search, tell, email, URL, and then the text area element itself. And in each of these cases, the order is as follows on screen, and I'll go through it all. And you're probably seeing it's very similar to the last one. The only difference is we've got now the addition of the placeholder. So ARIA label by will win, then ARIA label, then the label content, if it's associated with the input, otherwise the title, and then this new one, the placeholder, and then no accessible name. So very similar in concept to the previous one. Now, I should also say that the select, which wasn't listed up here as an option, is very similar. The only difference is it doesn't have a placeholder. So this exact order would be the same without the placeholder. So as before, we're going to look at some examples and see them in action. We're going to use the same methodology, 1, 2, 3, 4, but this time we're going to include 5 for the placeholder, and we'll look at them each in turn and just see how they work. So let's look at example 17. We have a label saying 3. We can see the placeholder there saying 5, but let's go on a little tiny bit of text underneath saying 1. Let's go and inspect element on the input, accessibility tree, and you'll see, as just like with a button, the ARIA label by wins. It's beating the ARIA label, beating the label, beating the placeholder, and beating the title. So very similar in approach. Go to the next example. Look at the accessibility tree. This time it's 2 because there's no ARIA label by. The ARIA label beats the label itself, beats the placeholder, beats the title. Next example. Again, the accessibility tree. In this case, there's no ARIA label by, no ARIA label. There is a label itself, and that's delivering the name of 3. There's the placeholder's being beaten and the title's being beaten. 20. I think I'm on the right one. Yep, the title. So in this case, if we look at the accessibility tree, there's no name attached to this. There's no label. So we don't have an ARIA label by. We don't have an ARIA label. There's no label. There is a placeholder. Now, this is where it gets interesting. The title should win here because it's number 4, and it's actually should say 4. But you'll see that the label, the name says 5. And very strangely, the placeholder is unexpectedly beating out the title. And we'll come back and talk about that in a minute. Next one down is the actual placeholder. This one should be in the correct order. The accessibility tree. No ARIA label by, no ARIA label, no label itself. There's no title. There is a placeholder with a value of 5. So the accessible name for that element is 5. And then just like before, we can have a quick look at an example with no accessible name. I just did it on the actual thing itself. That was very silly. Inspect element. So in this case, there's no ARIA label by, there's no ARIA label, there's no placeholder, and there's no title. So this input literally has no accessible name. And just like the button or the A element, that's a really bad scenario. Because what would happen is when a person comes down to here, they would actually hear, it would say something like input type equals text, type text or begin typing, whatever the instruction would be. But there's no instructions about what that's going to be used for. So just like before, while there's all these different methods we can use, where possible, use the label content. It's the most accessible, it's native, we don't have to do any messing around. It's a beautiful scenario. And the accessible description is exactly the same as before. ARIA described by, title, and then no description there at all. So we can skip over that because we've done a few of them, but generally speaking, just as before, we should always use the describe by rather than the title. So we're going to quickly talk about the placeholder, and just like the title, it's got all sorts of problems. Now, what's weird about the placeholder is it shouldn't, despite the rules, it shouldn't beat the title, but it does. And I've got a quick example here on that. Inspect element. Oh, did the wrong thing again. Got to go off to the page. So look at the accessibility tree, you'll see that the title should win, but the placeholders won. And the weird thing about that is, even if there is an accessible name in place, the placeholder is often still announced. It's so dastardly. And in some cases, the placeholder is announced as part of the accessible name. And in some cases, it's announced as part of the accessible description. Again, like the title, it is a terrible thing to use. It can be used very sparingly in certain situations, but should be avoided. In reality, it should never be used as the only visible text label, should never be used as the accessible name, and should never be used as an attempt at a description. Okay, the image element. We're getting a bit quicker now. In the case of the image element, much the same as before. The only difference is the third option is the alt attribute. And ideally, like what we said with the others, we should always use that native option. The alt attribute is the perfect way to give the element an accessible name. And again, same pattern for description. But fundamentally, I could be wrong here. I've very rarely found a need to put a description with an image. So normally the alt attribute is all you need. Happy to be corrected though. And I think the last one we're going to cover off is the field set. And you'll see exactly the same pattern. ARIA label by ARIA label, in this case, the legend content, the title, and no accessible name. But I'm sure there's a few people on the call who are already going, but that's wrong. You're lying. And yes, I am lying. That's what it should do. But in reality, that's often what doesn't happen. Again, the descriptions are described by title and no description. But let's have a look at the problem. Our last little case here is the field sets problem. So in theory, you should be able to apply an ARIA described by to the field set itself. That should be fine. But the problem is that it often doesn't work. And I've got a quick example here where an error message is associated with a field set via the ARIA described by. So there's a bit of code on screen. All we need to worry about is there's a field set with ARIA described by and a value. And inside the field set, after some form controls, there's an error message which has a matching ID. Now, in theory, that should make them work together. As soon as you hit the field set, that should be announced, in theory. But that's not really the case. It's not supported very well at all. And so what ends up happening is there are many ways to do it. The method I use, and I would love to hear some arguments and abuse in the discussion, is to apply it to the inputs themselves inside there. So this is a bit of a hack, but it does work. We have the error message being associated directly with each input. They have their own ARIA described by. But there we go. I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted. We've been through a lot together. I think we've grown, all of us, from this discussion. We've looked at visible text labels. We've looked at the accessible names. We've looked at whether those two concepts need to match, are described by, and then this big concept around which one wins, especially struggling with accessible names and descriptions. So that really leads us to, hopefully out of that, have you learned a little bit about those three concepts? And if not, I think it's about time for some questions. So I might throw over to, there's a lot in chat and there's some questions in Q&A. So you can click through these. Someone's talking about ARIA description, but let's go to the questions. When there's both an accessible name and a description, are they announced in that order? And is the description a good method for form input errors? Vernon, great question. So the way it works is assistive technologies all have roughly the same pattern. They'll actually say the name, the role, and then the description, and then some further instructions. So it'll be something like, let's use an example of a button. It might be something like submit button, and then it would say the description, and then use the enter key to access that. That's a really bad version of what we're going on. But basically, the order is the accessible name and role, and then the description, and then some additional information. Now, in VoiceOver, there's actually the accessible name and role and a pause, and then the description. So in VoiceOver, you'll actually hear this pause before the description is announced. And to answer your other question, is the description a good method for input errors? Well, ideally, there's a thing called the ARIA error message. And I might just quickly go to a page. Because in my spare time, I'm very bored and I build out hundreds of test cases. And one way we could do it, let me increase screen size here. One way we could do it is, here we have an error message associated with an import. And you see, instead of using aria described by, we're using aria error message, which is the perfect method to do it. And you'll see there's a matching ID down below. Now, those should actually work. But if you look at the support, it's only supported at this stage by JAWS. So it's a great question, Vernon. The simple answer is the most semantic would be the aria error message. But at this stage, its support is pitiful. Hope that answers your question. Next one is, if you have a button with an icon but no text inside, is it better to use something like an aria label or an aria describer on the icon, or screen readers ignore? Oh, there's so many things to unpack in there, Laura. So let's just say the first thing is, if there's an icon only, then that's only going to be useful for sighted users, and even for some sighted users, it might be a good idea to include some text in there as well. But let's say that the designer is a very angry person that only wants to include an icon, then yes, the aria label is one way where we can apply an accessible name straight to that element. So I've actually used this many times when I've worked with designers who work on like a modal, and there's an X up in the top corner for closing the modal, and they don't want to write the word close there because they're designers. And so in those particular, I sound like I'm really bagging designers here, but in those cases, if they insist on just having the X there, then yes, one way would be to put an aria label there. Now, it should be the aria label and not the description, because we want to give it a name, not a description. So definitely that. Did I answer your question? I hope that answered your question, yeah. Anonymous attendee, I love your name, by the way. I'm curious about multiple buttons with the same text on it, e.g. add to cart. What would be the best practice for using aria description to associate? Oh, I love this question. As weird as it sounds, we were just discussing this internally within Intopia today. So yes, there are some concerns if you have a page with lots of buttons on them, all saying add to cart. And there's a number of ways you could do it. If you felt that there was enough context on the page for screen readers to gather what they're adding to cart, you might be able to leave them as they are. But generally speaking, especially for users just tabbing through them, all they would hear to add to cart. So there are two ways you could do it. One way would be to add an aria label and drown out the words add to cart and put something like add X to cart. So that's one way to do it. And the other one is to associate via, as you said, by a description, and go and find the name of the product and use that as an aria describe by, or even an aria label by. And depending on the order you want to do it, you could sort of add to or improve it. The problem with aria label by is it will drown out to the add to cart again. So unless the text that you're grabbing is equally meaningful, it may not work on its own. So the three options are aria label by, and literally say add X to cart or add to cart X or something like that. The other one would be add to cart and then put aria describe by and drag the product there, and then it would be announced as add to cart something. And the third one would be to use aria label, which is a little bit more complicated, because it might not do what you need. I hope that answers your question, anonymous attendee. Daniel, where is a good place to set up test cases like what you have here? I'm not sure what you mean there. I just build them out in HTML because I'm old school, but you can definitely use anything. I mean, one quick way that you could build out your own test cases is using CodePen. And I'm just going to put that into chat, because CodePen allows you to create your own stuff with literally, oh, that went to panelists only. Let me get sent to everyone. I'm an idiot. CodePen, there we go, that's gone to everyone. So Daniel, you could actually use things like CodePen and literally create your own examples here very quickly and easily, so that you can see them in action. And in fact, if you look here, I use those things all the time. I've got literally examples of aria describe by, so that I can teach people how to use various components there. So yeah, CodePen's a very quick and easy way where you don't need to host anything, and yeah, it's really good to use. And Heron, hey Heron, good to see you. And yes, Heron loves CodePen too. Yeah, there's hundreds of them. Jay's Fiddle. Oh my God, the list is endless. You choose the one that you like the best. Heron, that's not really a question. Oh, sorry. How do the IRA label impact speech recognition? Oh my God, Heron coming in with a curly question. Yeah, okay. This is a really good question. So we're talking about something like Dragon, which is a very frustrating concept on its own. So yeah, there can be concerns. And I can see, Heron, you've deliberately tried to trip me up here, which is fantastic. But yeah, there's another reason why you want the visible text label and the accessible name to be the same. It means that what you see on screen is likely to be found by Dragon and those other tools and announced correctly. If you have very tricky labels where you're hiding content and doing all this fancy stuff, there's a possibility that Dragon may not understand that label and then may not be able to identify that field. So it's another really good reason why the closer we can get to a match between visible text label and accessible name, the better. I hope that answered that question. How, and this is an anonymous attendee again, how well does ARIA label translate, i.e. oh, good question, anonymous. So there was a period where the ARIA label wasn't translated at all. In fact, it used to have major problems. And I remember giving a talk about 2 years ago and someone went in a chat and said, oh, I would never use them because they don't translate. And I remember this was about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And I quickly went and did some testing. And as far as I found with my testing, the ARIA label translated very well more recently into other languages. So I think it's a lot better now. I'd like to actually go and do more testing, but in the tests I've found, that was the case. So I have a feeling that I've answered everything in questions. Let's have a look in chat. Alison coming in with the add extra card. Gah, yeah, you're right, Alison. Someone's talking, David Powell. I think that must have been because I was talking about designers. Yeah, Alison's right that add to cart, add extra cart, that there's no really nice way to do it. I mean, Alison, if you've got a suggestion in chat, please feel free to add it. All of these solutions are a bit hacky, to be honest. Steve says presentation. I think the presentation, yes, the slides are already in there now. It's all as a GitHub repo, so you can grab it as you want. I think that's it. Is there any other questions? If not, I can give you back about 10 minutes in your day. Oh, more, is there more? I think we've answered all the questions. Well, it's been an honor to work with you all. Oh, there's one new message, a couple more messages. Let me check. Oh, that's it. Yep. Thank you everyone for coming along. Great to have you all here. Stay tuned. There's going to be a lot more Intopia talks throughout the year with much better, more qualified presenters who are actually sober. So I think that's something to look forward to in the future. Have a great day, everyone. Hope you're all well. Catch you and on.